We will get started. Good afternoon. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of Episcopal Parish Network, and we're thrilled to have you joining us today for the last in our series in partnership with the Living Church on a beautiful Holy Week and preparing for the liturgies, and today on the Easter Vigil. And we're thrilled to have back our expert panel and welcome them again. And it is terrific to be in partnership with the Living Church on this topic, and we'll be doing more of these later in the year on other subjects. Also, thank you so much for all of you who have registered and will be joining us next week in Charlotte. We will be gathering our largest annual conference, EPN 2026. Over 800 folks will be getting together at the Sheridan Le Meridien. There is room for you. If you want to register, go to episcopalparishes.org. Or join us in Denver the following year, February 23rd through 26th, 2027. Never too soon to put those dates in your calendar. Really excited about this year. And of course, the Living Church will be there with us, duly represented. And without any further ado from me, we'll get into the conversation, and I'm going to hand it off to Matthew. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Sean and to Robert, and look forward to a great conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. It's always great to collaborate with you and with EPN. For those of you who are going to be there next week, I will too. So I'd love to connect if we can. It's great to be finishing up this series. Last year, we attempted to do this in one day, which is crazy. And so we thought we would spread it out over 4 days. I'm also wondering if I was a little crazy in agreeing to do 4 webinars 4 days in a row, but it's been great. So I want to thank the panelists who've been here. I'll reintroduce them, but Father Sean Strout and Father Robert Hendrickson, and then Nathan Jennings and Annette Brownlee, who participated earlier in the week. So my thanks to all of them. My name is Matthew Ulver. I'm the Executive Director and Publisher at the Living Church Foundation. I'm also a liturgical scholar, and my area is early Christian Eucharistic practice, especially in the Latin West, and then also the history of the Book of Common Prayer. So this is our last webinar about Holy Week, and we're going to be focusing on the Great Vigil of Easter, which we could probably fill 2 or 3 sessions on this, but we'll try to be focused here. Here's how we'll proceed. I'm going to give a brief introduction here. For those of you who've been here before, some of this will sound a little familiar, but some helpful general instructions before we move to the specifics. Then, after my little introduction, Sean and I will go back and forth looking at the first 2 sections of the Easter Vigil, the service of light and the service of lessons. Then we'll kick it over to Robert to lead us in thinking about preaching, and then we'll come back to look around questions around Christian initiation taking place at the Easter Vigil. So obviously Holy Week is a big lift for parish clergy and also for the musicians. If you are going to have music at all of these services, this is as, I think as physically as tiring as it is emotionally tiring for musicians as well. It's a huge undertaking. It's also one of those things that I think people find to be one of the real distinctive markers of Episcopal life. For those, especially who came into the Episcopal Church from other places, many of them talk about how their first experience of one or more of the Holy Week liturgies sealed the deal for them. And I have to tell you, my memory of the Easter Vigil, my first one, is extremely strong. And one of the really wise things Sean said earlier in the week is to actually take care, all of us, from setting up that original experience as the sort of North Star for every other vigil or Maundy, Thursday, or Good Friday. Because that can really take us away from a cognizance and an awareness of our own particular context, which is probably not the one in which we had that experience. And they also are not us. So this attentiveness is really important. And this is what we want to try to think about today. One of the things, of course, that's, I think, interesting, ironic even, is that this feature of contemporary Episcopal life, these Holy Week rites, are historically speaking novel for the Anglican tradition. It's one of the many things that were removed in the work that Cranmer did to turn 7 books into one. Obviously, you had to cut some things, and this found its way to the cutting room floor. And while some of the cathedrals and other large churches continued doing some of these things outside the authorization of the Church of England, they basically died away. But starting at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, Anglo-Catholics and ritualists started reintroducing versions of these rites. Some of them were done kind of ad hoc on their own, basically taking the Latin liturgy, translating it into something of a Cranmerian form. The various missal traditions also provided versions of this as well. And it started to appear, but it was not until 1960 that the Episcopal Church formally made any provision, and that provision was still very, very brief. A liturgy for blessing palms on Palm Sunday, and then a blessing of the Paschal Candle for Easter Vigil. That is not, a blessing of the candle for Easter Eve. If you wanted to do a vigil, you had to look somewhere else. So what appears in the 79 prayer book, this section of rites that are described as proper liturgies for special days, was something altogether more full and complete than had ever been in any Anglican prayer book before that. And I think after a couple generations, this feels pretty fixed for most Episcopalians. Even if their church doesn't do everything, they're fully aware that churches do, and that this is a part of our life. These rites, of course, weren't created out of whole cloth. The committee did not sit down and have some creative brainstorming sessions about what they might like to do during Holy Week. These are basically simplified versions of the Western version of these rites that have a very ancient pedigree. And I've said this at all the sessions before, but I want to encourage you, if you have never read it, to pick up the Pilgrimages of Egeria, of her descriptive journaling of her trip, her 3-year trip to Jerusalem in the 4th century, where she describes in great detail how all of these rites were celebrated. And if you're going to read this, keep your prayer book next to you, because you can follow along and see a very straight line to these liturgies. So this is one of the most ancient things that the prayer book contains, with a straight line to the 4th and 5th centuries, which is kind of amazing. So I want to give a couple pieces of practical advice that is more general, before we move to the specifics of this rite itself. So first, I want to encourage parish clergy, and then other folks who are involved, your musicians, lay folks, to consult a number of different ceremonial guides. For the more Anglo-Catholics, ritual notes, Percy Dermer's Parson's Handbook might be places to start. Those are difficult to use because they assume the English prayer book. So it requires a great deal of translation if you are going to try and use them. But there are several texts that have been produced with the 79 prayer book directly in mind. Lee Mitchell's Lent, Holy Week, and Easter is one of the 3 ceremonial guides that was published by Cowley. Dennis Mitchnow's Priest's Handbook is probably on almost every priest's shelf or their desk. But I do want to encourage everyone to consult multiple guides. I think it's very helpful, especially because, unlike the Roman Missal, which is very specific and gives you clear direction, the prayer book is extremely limited in what you are required and told to do. And all of these handbooks are going to be someone's take on how to apply some set of liturgical principles to the 79 prayer book. And those things, I think, are legitimately debatable. And so I think it's helpful to look at a couple of sources. Another source that can be honestly really helpful is to get a copy of the current Roman Missal, because the rubrics are so specific. that at least is helpful, and it can be another place to look. So that brings me to my second suggestion. One of my rules or laws that I give to my students when we begin practical liturgics and thinking from a big picture place is this, that you really want to have considered carefully everything that you're going to normally do in a liturgy before you do it. And this is only more true when it comes to these very distinctive liturgies that happen just once a year. So, in order to do that considering, probably the best way to do this is to actually have it written out. And something that will be a gift to yourself in a year, to the people you're working with, and also to your predecessor, because somebody will come after you, so that they can know with some accuracy what happened before they got there. To have a clear, detailed customary for all the Holy Week liturgies for all the participants, but then also for your altar guild. And pictures makes this way, way easier. And related to that, I really want to encourage you to schedule a meeting or maybe a couple meetings after Holy Week to review each of those liturgies and to do so in a detailed way. Have your bulletins, walk through them, make notes about what worked, what adjustments you might want to make for next year. I actually would try after each of the Holy Week liturgies to make notes on the bulletin right away so that I wouldn't forget, so that when we got to that meeting, I was prepared. So that's the second suggestion. Third is just a general encouragement, and that is to not think about these liturgies as an opportunity for creativity, but rather an opportunity to keeping in mind the particularity of your context, that is your congregation's history and your building, to do your best to allow these liturgies to be a means by which people can enter into the mystery of Jesus Christ. That is what we're here to do. And we're not here to reenact the first century or the fourth century or any of those things. Liturgies can if you look at a liturgy, you could be forgiven for thinking that you're looking at a play. You have stage directions, you have words for people to say, but it is not a play. It is the most real thing that we do. And it's a gift by which we can encounter the God who has come in the flesh and was raised for us. So this is a pastoral task as much as anything. A couple more practical suggestions. Your bulletins for these days should never leave your congregation in doubt about what they're to do with their bodies or say with their mouths. I have to tell you, I'm just going to give you one of my pet peeves. There's nothing more irksome than picking up a bulletin that tells you what might happen rather than what will happen. The rubrics have lots of options. If you're going to print a bulletin telling people what is customary, that is what decisions you have made, so that they can follow along. Especially because these are so particular, you want to take out as much as possible people sort of looking up and thinking, what's happening? What am I supposed to do? That's not where you want them to be. You want them to be present to the mystery. That's why they're there. Two more brief suggestions. Rehearse. Schedule your rehearsal for all of these liturgies, and 30 minutes beforehand is not going to cut it. You need time when people aren't rushed, where questions can be asked, and where, especially if there's movement of people, that you have the opportunity to walk through that, see how long it actually takes, encounter the impediments you didn't imagine. Turns out this is very narrow. How do we solve this problem? There's a table that's in the way from earlier. How do we get that out of the way? All those things. So rehearsing is really important. Okay. Let me turn now and introduce our panelists here, and then we'll turn to them. So first is the Reverend Robert Hendrickson, who is based in Tucson. He recently concluded about a decade as rector of St. Philip's in the Hills, which is the largest congregation in the Diocese of Arizona. He's a graduate of General Theological Seminary And he earlier served as the subdean at St. John's Cathedral in Denver and as a curate at Christ Church, New Haven. And he just took on a new role at Forward Movement, serving the wider church as the chief of discipleship initiatives for Forward Movement. There's some really exciting things that they are working on and that are coming out. So please stay attuned. I bet at EPN there might be some tantalizing new information for the church to see what all you and Scott and everyone at Forward Movement is going to be working on. So thanks for that. And then our second panelist is the Reverend Sean Strout, who is the Associate Professor of Worship and Associate Dean of Chapel and Director of Assessment at Virginia Theological Seminary. He has a PhD in liturgical studies and sacramental theology from the Catholic University of America, and he's the author of Bound Together: Baptism, Eucharist, and the Church. He's been a priest for over 13 years, and he is presently the associate priest at Trinity Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. So thanks to you both for being here. Sean, why don't I turn it over to you, and how we're going to break down the vigil liturgy as the rubrics do themselves. So at the beginning, there's a concerning the vigil, and it tells us that the service normally consists of four parts: the service of lights, the service of lessons, Christian initiation, or the renewal of baptismal vows. I think this might be one of the only places that the phrase Christian initiation actually appears in the prayer book. And then finally, Holy Eucharist with the administration of Easter communion. So I'm going to turn this over to Sean, and he and I are going to, he's going to lead this. We'll have a little conversation. And then after service of lessons, we'll turn to Robert to think about homiletical issues, and then come back and finish by talking about initiation and the first Easter Eucharist. So Sean, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. So what Matthew was saying earlier about the rubrics is absolutely true, and we see it right away when we look at the very first rubric for this service. In the darkness, fire is kindled. That tells us everything we need to know right there, right? It's going to be in the darkness and fire is kindled. Well, where is this darkness? How is this fire kindled? What all is going on with that? It doesn't tell us in the rubrics. And of course, that's in a large part because it's going to depend on your context. Where are you? Where is your church? If you're a church out in a rural area, perhaps you can be outside and you might even have a significant, I've noticed some places even have had bonfires for the Easter Vigil. If you're in an urban church, clearly that's not going to be something you're going to be able to do. So maybe your fire is at the back of the church, and you have turned out all the lights in your church. But wherever it is, it's something that you really want to think about and you really want to consider carefully. How big will this fire be? How manageable will it be? Who will manage it as the service goes forward? Because, of course, we're talking at the very beginning of the service, but the service progresses and would probably not be wise to keep a fire unattended. So those are all questions that you're going to want to think through very, very carefully, because this is a powerful beginning to a service. You're in the darkness and you have this light of some source coming from some type of natural source, and it can be very powerful, a wonderful way to get started. But you do want to think that through. If it is going to be outside and you're going to have then folks process in just a moment, which we'll talk about, then you want to think about how is that going to happen? How will they process in the darkness and those kinds of logistics as well. And then it talks about, then you have the opening, dear friends, and kind of proclamation to the people, which is a beautiful, beautiful proclamation, and then a prayer. And then we come into the Paschal candle itself. And here's another important logistical moment for us to think about. What kind of Paschal candle do you have? Some folks have wax candles. Some folks have candles that are made of plastic and are filled with liquid paraffin. How are you going to light this candle? I don't suggest that you simply just kind of tip it over into the fire. That's probably not a good idea. So how are you going to because the idea is you want to take the fire that you have created and light the candle with that fire in some way. So will you use a taper? How will you do that in some way? And then, depending on your church and the traditions of your own church, there are a number of things that might happen with this Paschal candle. There are ways in which you can inscribe on, if it is indeed made of wax, and you might inscribe onto the candle Alpha and Omega, the year that it is, putting in pieces of incense. There's all different kinds of things that you can do. And as Matthew talked about, you can find some of those in the ceremonial guides that you have. And sometimes it can be a very simple Paschal candle that may not have that extra adornment to it. But those are things that you want to think about through and how you're going to do them and what objects, if you are going to be inscribing, how are you going to inscribe that? If you're going to have those, where are those going to be placed? And all those kinds of logistics, so that when you get to this very important and emotional moment, you're not kind of scrambling around trying to find, well, where is this tool and where is that and where is everything? But it's all laid out, ready to go. You have people to help you with that and hand you the things that you need along the way. And then you have the procession. And this can be either the procession from outside into the church or the procession from the back of the church to the front of the church, again, depending on your context. And at some points along that procession, you're going to pause 3 times and either chant or say, "The light of Christ, thanks be to God." If you're a chanting church and you're chanting, just a little note here. It's often you'll chant and you'll raise in tone. Just be careful how much you raise in tone, or you may find yourself, if you're raising a whole step or even more, you may find yourself singing quite high by the time you get to the third chant there. So think that through as well if you happen to be chanting church. And that is, as the rubrics say, that is done by the deacon or the celebrant if there is no celebrant. So if you do have someone ordained as a deacon, then they would be the ones to process in first. If you are a church that has incense, then the thurifer may be the one to go in front. But in this case, this is an example of, if you're having a procession, typically the Paschal candle leads the way rather than the crucifer. Usually in most of our services, we have the cross leading the way, but in this particular service, we're making a change to have the Paschal candle lead the way through that. And
John,
then,
could I
yeah,
add
please.
something real quick? I It's interesting because while the 3 stations are required here for the Paschal candle, um, a similar or parallel 3 stations are done in some places with the cross the day before on Good Friday. So when the cross is
Mhm,
processed in with a similar proclamation, "Behold the wood of the cross on which was hung
mhm.
the world's salvation," and it's also sung on a step higher each time. And I, one year, started it way too high on the first one
Yes.
because I was feeling nervous. And let's just say that I did not find myself in a great place at the 3rd station. Um,
Yes.
so this might be a place to give somebody gives you a note is not a bad thing.
Yes, exactly. Right. And it's a great way, again, of how we think. Really, I'm sure, Matthew, you probably talked about this when you talked about Monday, that these are really is one service altogether, not 3 separate services. And that symbolism of the cross stopping at 3 stations, and then now the candle stopping at 3 stations is a powerful symbol and is well worth considering that. And then if you're going to have candles, then this would be how, for the rest of the congregation, you could have them lighting off of the Paschal candle and spreading that light throughout the entire congregation, and it can be really, really quite beautiful as the congregation starts to fill up with light. This is not usually the place in which you actually turn on your interior lights for the whole church. That will happen later on. So right now we're just kind of building some light in the darkness, but haven't quite filled the entire room with light yet. And then as you go forward, then you want to have a stand where you're going to put this Paschal candle, and that should be in a prominent place. Again, it all depends on how your church is configured, but you want it to be in a prominent place. If you are going to be having baptisms later, and depending on where your baptismal font is located, if you can have it around the baptismal font, but yet still in a prominent place, that's fantastic. But if your baptismal font is in the back, for example, it would be better at this service for the Paschal candle to be probably up at the front in some prominent place. And then we come to this beautiful, beautiful prayer called the Exultet, that has ancient roots to it. But do notice what the rubrics say. Then the deacon or other person appointed. So will either say or sing the Exultet. And I think this is very helpful for folks if you are planning to sing it. And now my students here at VTS, they are always learning those, especially those that get ordained as deacons before they graduate, are learning how to chant the Exultet, and are all stressful about that. It's a beautiful chant. It's not necessarily the easiest chant, however, that's out there. So if the chanting is not your gift, this may be an opportunity where you have a choir member who can even maybe partner with you in chanting the Exultet or chant the Exultet in your place. A cantor can help with that. But it can be a beautiful, beautiful aspect of this particular rite.
Sean, do you want to say anything about the relationship of the prominent place of the Paschal candle to the place from which the lessons will be proclaimed in the service of lessons?
Yeah, you could do that where this is going to be the focus point where the lessons will be proclaimed right where the Paschal candle is also placed. Again, that's a lot of that's going to depend on your architecture and the layout of your church and where you have, but the more that it is the focus for this part of the service, the better that it can be. And now this is also another little logistical thing, but for choirs and the readers is you may want to have lights that folks can see. So you can see because while the Paschal candle is beautiful, it doesn't necessarily produce a whole lot of light for all the readers. So you can have just those small little lights sometimes that can help the choir with singing and the readers with being able to see the text while still being able to keep a pretty dark congregation there. And so then you have the entire Exultet, which is beautiful. I won't necessarily go through all of that text, but it's well worth going through because it is a great rehearsal of our salvation history. And then at the end, I just do want to point out this final rubric here before going into the lessons. It is customary that the Paschal candle burn at all services from Easter Day through the day of Pentecost, and really that celebration of this powerful symbol of the Paschal candle. And of course, we also use it in baptisms and funerals throughout the year. So it's a strong and powerful symbol. Hand it over to
Excellent.
you, Matthew.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this introduction does not take up many pages, but the amount of work required to be properly prepared for it and the number of objects and movement is really considerable. So, that the preparation, I just want to just highlight that again. I have to tell you, I think at one of the first or second Easter vigils I was at, the candle was coming in. They chanted, "The light of Christ, thanks be to God," and then silence, and then a child just like busted out in tune, and to Jesus 'cause we love him, which I mean, it just was pretty great. I mean, you can't plan stuff like that. Um, okay, so we have the first part. At this point now, everyone, all the ministers and those who are serving have all processed in. They are to the places where they're going to be. As Sean was saying, working out the light situation is very important. And so this is where you actually need to rehearse this, try this out at night and figure out how much light is possible. Sometimes you may be able to use processional torches placed on either side of where the person is going to be, but you need to test it. And depending on your eyesight and the size of the text, all these things, you want to play this out because you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you honestly cannot read the collects or the lessons. Okay, so then we have another unique feature of the vigil, which is it's called a liturgy of the word, but it does not really function or is not really structured in the same way that any other liturgy of the word is. What you have is a series of readings that are meant to communicate and give you a feeling of a single arc or a sequence, a movement from point A through a significant history to a culmination point. The way it's structured is that you have a reading followed by a psalm or a canticle, and then that theme is collected with a collect that is led by one of the clergy. Um, there's a number of important details here. So I'm just going to read the one rubric here. So after the introduction to the vigil lessons, the rubric said at least two of the following lessons are read, of which one is always the lesson from Exodus, that is Israel's deliverance at the Red Sea. After each lesson, the psalm or canticle is listed, or another suitable psalm, canticle, or hymn may be used. A period of silence may be kept, and the collect provided or some other suitable collect may be said. Okay, I mentioned the other day that one of the radical innovations in the 79 prayer book is just the number of possibilities. Um, what I just read there had, I don't know how many mays there were, but there were a lot. Um, I don't suggest you make use of every may here. That is like, write a new collect, try something else out. I would encourage you, if this is your first or even your second or third time, to just use what's here. Um, the number of lessons here is significant. And I think one of the reasons that they give you the option to do two or all nine, or as many as all nine, is to provide some pastoral flexibility that if you're introducing something like this, if you're introducing this liturgy, it's worth asking how much is possible, how much is feasible for this congregation to receive. And it may be that a 3.5 hour vigil as your first vigil is maybe not the best move. So I think thinking through that is important. It's also traditional that the lessons are proclaimed in the older form, that is without responses. So this is again another that principle of older days preserving an older form. So the lessons are introduced simply with the summary of what is happening, the story of creation. It's read, and then the reader typically ends by saying thanks be to God without the congregational response. Then you have the psalms or hymns. There's a lot of room is given here, um, so that if say congregational chanting of psalms is not very common, it provides opportunity for maybe more familiar hymnody to be used that thematically would work. So this is a place of, I think, real care in your preparation between you and your team, your musician, to think about what is possible. And part of that is thinking through with your musician what the whole of that Holy Week musical load. So how much that is unusual are they doing on the other days of this week? So how much is actually feasible for your choir to be able to prepare what can be shared as congregational song? Um, Finally, I just note here that like the collects um, at the solemn collects on Good Friday, that form of the chanting might also be used here, that simpler form where you just have a reciting note and move one step up and one step down. Um, but if you are going to chant them, because there are so many, it can be very helpful to have marked them ahead of time so that you're not sort of doing that on the fly, unless that is just second nature to you, and really easy. Um, Sean, do you have anything to add before just say something here about the sermon, and then I'll hand it over to Robert?
I would just say this is the moment when you really also want to be discerning about your readers
Yes,
that you have. This is, again, we're not trying to be dramatic, but at the same time, we want to have our more experienced readers reading this because, especially if you are planning to use a number of lessons, then you do want it to be where people are remaining engaged through all of this. So it's probably a good idea to use your more experienced readers for this part of the service.
absolutely. I mean, this is again a reminder, standing up and reading ancient texts in public is very weird. This is a very strange thing that happens in church. And it turns out ancient texts or just reading in public is hard. And doing it in such a way that allows the text to rise and not be so self-referential, but really allow people to hear and receive is a learned task. So after the final collect, O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, a collect that shows up. The other place it shows up is the collect at ordinations. Um, it says a homily may be preached after any of the preceding readings. Um, my experience has been that if a homily happens, it typically happens at the end of all the lessons, but it's certainly you're allowed to do it after any of them. Um, the other place that the homily can fall is after the gospel at the first Easter Eucharist. I was telling my colleagues here that um, with Timothy Kimbrough at Chapel, um, at Holy Family in Chapel Hill, his practice was to have two. The bishop would always preach at this point, and then he would preach John Chrysostom's Easter homily in after the gospel in the Eucharist. These people were all in on the vigil, I should say. So they were all excited about this. This may not be the plan for most parishes, um, but it then tells us that the baptisms can take place here, or they can take place where they would typically take place if you had baptisms on a Sunday, namely after the gospel and or the homily. So before we move on to talk about initiation and the Eucharist, let's turn it over to Father Hendrickson to help us think on the homiletical questions here.
Yeah, thank you. If you really wanted to go all in, you could do a sermon after each reading and really take it up a notch, but
Exactly.
you got to commit.
How committed are you, really?
How much do you love Jesus? The place I wanted to start sort of thinking about preaching for the vigil and Easter more broadly is I guess at the tomb of Jesus, and I will tell a little story. Had the opportunity, I've had a couple of times to spend overnight in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which you can sort of arrange through sort of various myriad Byzantine ways, but you can stay overnight in the church. You have to stay awake all night. You can't lay down, but you can stay through the night. And so I happened to be there on the night before Orthodox Christmas. And so there was a lot of activity going on. People were in there cleaning, and it was about 2 or 3 in the morning. There was a lot of cleaning going on and stuff. And I was sitting right outside the tomb, and I heard a little bit of noise inside there. And if you haven't been, there's two sections, right? There's an outer part of the tomb, and then there's the inner part where the tomb itself is. And so I kind of made my way into the first part, and I sat and I heard more noise in there. And then I leaned over and I saw this little boy, probably maybe 7, 8 years old, and he had several Matchbox cars that he was driving around on the top of the tomb of our Lord. You know, and it, you know, and it, part of me, you have this moment where you're like, I don't know if I'm aghast or if I'm charmed or what this is, and I've come to really love the moment. And what I loved about it was this complete and utter comfort in the presence of the most ineffable mystery that Christians believe in, and yet the complete comfort just dwelling there in the presence of that, in the middle of that mystery. And in some ways, I think that's the preaching task, is to bring people to the place of resurrection, where it's such a lived reality that is a thing with which they are completely comfortable as encompassing the entirety of their lives. And that's, and that is not done, I don't think, by simply encouraging an assent to a set of doctrinal propositions. That there's something about the what the preacher brings to the task is their experience of resurrection, not their doctrinal, the doctrinal minutia of how it happened. And what people, I firmly believe, what they do not need is some sort of historical critical take on the mechanics of what happened, right? I think what they need from the church is a reminder that this is the deepest reality in their life, and no matter what they bring to the story has something to say to them. And I think about this when I was younger, relatively rapid succession. My mother and my sister both died. And when you're a kid, you have no idea what to make of that. And when you're a younger adult, or maybe a teenager, you're just angry at God all the time if you believe. And so for me, hearing that the resurrection proclamation every year is not only an eschatological or cosmic thing, it's a deeply personal thing. And it's going to be for every person in your congregation. That proclamation of the truth of the resurrection is it is how fire is kindled in the darkness, right? And that's what you're doing there, right? You're kindling so many different kinds of fire. And so they don't need like an outlet version of the resurrection, a Timu resurrection, right? They need you to proclaim the full freight of the truth of the gospel in that moment. Um, and the other thing I will often encourage is in the same way the liturgy is multi-layered. I think the sermon can be a multi-layered thing. And I think part of our task is to think about what are all the different ways that people take in truth? What are all the different ways they create meaning? And for some of us, that's going to be through some doctrinal stuff. So there's a little bit of that you're going to do. For most people, many people, it's storytelling, right? That they want to hear, they hear something that resonates with them, that matches a pattern they know in their own life. For other people, that may be an artistic engagement or a musical engagement. But I think thinking of the kind of multi-sensory, multivalent ways that people understand truth is part of what we can bring to the preaching task. Thinking of the range of people who are in the congregation. But ultimately, the thing I ask myself before, I try and ask myself before every sermon, but particularly at Easter and at Christmas Eve, I think to myself, if this is someone's first or last time in this church, what truth do I want them to hear about Christ? And I think if that's the approach we take, if it's someone's first or last time, or if they're giving the church one more chance, what do we hope they walk away with? And it's not going to be our erudition, right? What we want them to walk away with is a sense of our conviction and the truth of the gospel, and it's a truth that is not offered from the point of us being another litigant in the culture wars, but from the point of us having a truth deeper than all the stuff that we think is so important from day to day. I think people have a sense that much of what we're wrestling with day to day is not the most important thing we could be doing with our existence. And that this is a chance to call people back to first things, right? Back to the reason we were created, back to the reason we were called into covenant, back to the reason we were called to the foot of the cross, back to the reason we were called to a deep and abiding belief in the resurrection and the power of our baptismal life. And that, and all that sounds like I don't know, a big task, but thanks be God, it's just the thing we have done for 2,000 years, right? I mean, and so as I said yesterday, sort of being being stewards and shepherds of this mystery, all we're doing is passing along what was handed to us. And so it is a daunting task, but it's one it is our great joy to have inherited, and it's our great joy to pass along. So the thing that I was always encouraging is how to take a moment, which can seem like a task, and make it an opportunity for some deeper relationship to develop. Right. So the preaching task is not you getting up there as an expert, sort of saying, "I will now teach you about the resurrection." The preaching task is to say, "I find my life in these texts in this way. I find my life in the reality of the resurrection in this way, and I find Jesus alive in my life in these ways." Right. And all those things speak to truth in a different way. And in the same way, you could ask three different artists, a realist, a surrealist, and a cubist, to draw a crucifix, right? You get three very different things speaking to the same thing. And I think that's part of what we bring to the preaching task, right? We're bringing all these different lenses that are part of our life, part of our understanding of truth, that we bring to bear on the resurrection, hoping that one of them strikes someone, hoping that one of them says, aha, that opens something for them. But I think that the chief thing we can do is be there, speak to the truth of what's unfolding, and then get out of the way. You know what I mean? Try not to be too charming, too clever, whatever it is. Get out of the way. Let the liturgy speak. Let the words of 2,000 years speak, and let the reality of eternity speak. And if we can do that, then we can, like a blackjack dealer, say, I'm out. Go home and have yourself a gin or something at the end of the night. But anyway, that's what I've got for now.
I should say that's the first time that gin has been mentioned in any four of these webinars.
Oh, I don't know whether maybe that needs to be censored out. I apologize.
No, not at all.
I didn't realize it's a Puritan webinar. I apologize.
No, not at all. Not at all. Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, I mean, the task here is to present this opportunity for the encounter with Christ, and in particular the power of his actions here and in the Paschal mystery. Okay, so we're getting to the end here, but we definitely need to talk about Christian initiation. So I'm going to turn this back over to Sean, and we can you can help us think through. There's a number of like possibilities here. So help us think through this.
Yes, thanks, Matthew. So as Matthew mentioned, there are a couple of possibilities around where we put initiation. We can put it in this place, or we can put it in the place that we're most familiar with in our regular Sunday liturgies, which is after the reading of the gospel and or the homily. And that's not an arbitrary decision to make. It's a decision you really want to think through. It probably will also be tied to where you'll put the sermon. As well. You may, because especially if you're going to have a baptism and or confirmation, there's a very big chance, I would hope, that you're going to want to address that in your sermon. So probably if you're going to have the baptism and confirmation later in the service, you're probably also going to have the sermon later in the service as well. And of course, if you're having a confirmation, that means the bishop is present. Probably a good idea to ask the bishop where the bishop may want to have this part of the service as well. So that's really something to think about. And of course, you also need to think about the progression of lessons. The lessons that we've had so far up to this point have come from the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures. We've not yet had the lesson from Romans or from the gospel lesson. So you could certainly speak to that in your sermon and kind of, foretell it if you wanted to. But more than likely, if you're really wanting to address one of those lessons, the sermon probably would be more effective afterward. So that's another thing to think about as well. And then finally, I would say there's a real logistical thing to think about. No, don't let this be the determiner, because you can always work with logistics. I think thinking through the theological arc of the service is the most important thing to consider. But logistically, at this point, we're still in darkness. So if you're going to have a full-on baptism at this point, it's going to be done in the dark. And so that's just something to, again, think about in terms of having some sort of additional lighting, whether that's the Paschal candle and other candles around or something else, so that you can maneuver and do all the things that we do in baptisms in the darkness if it's going to be here. While if you have it later on, by this point you probably have raised all of the lights and it will be in lightness. I do remember doing once a baptism in the dark, and that was a different experience. I'll say that for sure. But most importantly, I do want to impress upon you that even if you're not having a baptism or confirmation, to have the renewal of baptismal vows. The rubrics are actually clear here that you are to do the renewal of baptismal vows. Of course, a baptism or confirmation is optional depending on whether that would occur, but it does say that you should have the renewal of baptismal vows. And I just want to put in a plug for the other times when the prayer book strongly encourages to have them at Pentecost, at All Saints' Day, at the baptism of our Lord, and of course, when a bishop may be visiting. Those are just such powerful points to remember our baptismal life. And even if we're not having baptisms on those days, to renew our baptismal vows together. And you might include, if you're a parish that has this, asperging, where you sprinkle water on everyone as a symbol of that baptismal renewal that we're having. So, but it's very powerful and is an important piece of the Easter Vigil service.
John, I might add here the introduction to the renewal of vows that's given in the Easter Vigil on page 292 is a beautiful construction, and it actually can be used at every baptism. So I just want to note that the rubrics in the baptism liturgy itself indicate it says the celebrant what does it say? The celebrant says in these or similar words. And given that the prayer book provides you similar words, but which are even weightier, just a few pages earlier, I would encourage you to use them. And all you need to do is just omit at other times, now that our Lenten observance is ended, and the introduction is completely useful. Um, and I mean, how awesome, right? To renew the solemn promises and vows of holy baptism by which we once renounced Satan and all his works and promised to serve God faithfully in his holy Catholic Church.
And along
Um,
those lines too, Matthew, if you're using the renewal of baptismal vows at another time, one of those other
yes.
times, it really that we should use the form that's here on 292 rather than the baptismal covenant, because you have that first question: do you reaffirm your renunciation of evil and renew your commitment to Jesus Christ? I
Yeah.
do. Which is not found in the baptismal covenant because you've done that
Yes.
earlier in the rite. So
Exactly.
those two are two excellent points. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple logistical things to think about with the baptism, regardless of where it's going to be, but especially if you're having it in the earlier place. Thinking about how everyone is going to get there, and
Mhm.
as Sean said, how it's going to be lit, so that people can see, I think is quite important. Um, the rubrics in the baptismal liturgy also note that the prayers for the candidates can function to cover that procession. It also mentions psalms that can be sung. The Taizé, there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, can also work very well because you can just repeat it as long as you need to, and you can then stop when everyone is situated. In the older rites, the procession to and from the font was covered by the litany. So in the old rite, it was the litany, the saints on the way there, and then it was the petitions on the way back. Back up to the altar for the beginning of the Easter Eucharist. Um, in terms of planning, another I think big a logistical challenge is how you are going to bring light back um, at the proclamation of the resurrection and the Alleluia. Um, I'm sure all of us have maybe been at places where, it's like 15 seconds of like one switch, another switch, another switch, another switch, which is, I mean, it's not a play, but I think that it it is a dramatic moment that I think should be planned well. Some churches, right, have a control panel that can control all the lights, and some of them actually have pre-programmed settings. So if you have that, it may actually be helpful to have an Easter Vigil setting that actually takes like 5 seconds to bring up everything in a kind of clean way, as opposed to also flipping on from nothing to everything in a moment can also be like quite startling. Um, the um, the Easter Eucharist itself is very straightforward. Once you have the Easter proclamation, then you have one of the canticles, the Gloria, the Te Deum, the Pascha Nostrum, the Collect, and then things move quite directly. You have a short epistle. Um, this is the only place where the traditional minor proper of the Alleluia is given direction, and that's because there was also a particular Alleluia form that was for the first Easter Mass, and that was just a long, quite florid Alleluia that, like the Paschal Candle and the Proclamation of the Cross, was sung 3 times on a higher pitch each time. So the parallelism, I think, is not accidental of these key proclamations at key moments in the liturgy that are done in a similar musical way. Um, then you have the gospel, um, and as Sean I think helpfully described, the kind of features that go into the decision making process about where to have the sermon. So if it was not earlier, it would be here. Notice the rubrics are clear that the Nicene Creed is not used, even though this is not just a major feast, but a principal feast. We have already had the baptismal creed, that is the Apostles' Creed, that's been used. And but the prayers of the people do take place, and then it proceeds directly as normal through the celebration of the Eucharist. We are at 2 minutes to 3. I love our timing here. I wonder, Sean or Robert, if either of you have any parting words, suggestions, encouragements that you might want to give.
Rest. Rest through this whole week. This is not the week to be planning a whole lot of things because you still have Sunday morning to get to.
Yeah.
So rest.
Mine is
Yes.
connected to that in some ways. It's bring your kids to the vigil. Like,
Mm.
this is when their religious imagination is being formed, and you want it formed in this way. So take make it. It's hard, but do it, and encourage your people to do it.
Excellent. Um, I think an email is going to go out with some resources. I will make sure that's included there, a text of John Chrysostom's Easter homily, if that is something you want to consider using. I mean, once you read it, you do sort of conclude it's pretty hard to improve upon this. It's also quite short, um, and then it also gives you, especially if you're solo. It means that you can focus your creative homiletical writing on the Easter Day sermon. And the complexity of the liturgy is a lot at the vigil. And John Chrysostom has given us, an incomparable sermon for sure. So, and I see there's already a link to it here. Excellent in the chat. I want to thank my panelists today. Father Sean Strout and Father Robert Hendrickson, panelists from earlier this week, Nathan Jennings and Annette Brownlee, and all of you for joining us. The video for this webinar and the 3 previous ones will all be available on EPN's YouTube page. You'll be getting a link about that probably before the end of the day. So thanks so much. God bless you, and hope to see many of you at EPN next week. Thanks.